morning. This is Anna Patterson with the North Carolina Housing Coalition. Thank you for joining us this morning for our housing call. And without further ado, I will turn it over to our Director of Housing Policy, Stephanie Watkins Cruz.
Good morning, everyone. I hope you all are having a great week so far, and cooling down a bit. Some top things that we're going to lift up for you this week. We have actually three top things. The first is that still have no budget. Today is the first day of the new fiscal year at the state level. There are some rolling house sessions happening in the General Assembly, but essentially they're on break. And so when there's no budget, that means a continuing budget is triggered. And there are a few programs that are impacted, and I will mention that shortly. Also, last week, the second thing we want to lift up is that the State of the Nation's Housing 2025 report was released last week. And it honestly just continues to show what we know, that there is a continued and growing need for affordable housing options of all types at all income levels. Just want to lift up a few of those points there for you later in the call as well. And then also, actually, this morning still, we're kind of waiting on some updates on federal legislation titled the Big Beautiful Bill that passed the House just barely last month. And the Senate, as of just 10 minutes ago, still hadn't voted on it. So this legislation continues to really threaten, honestly, the infrastructure we have for housing resources and programming, as well as the very resources and programming that a lot of our programs, from development to stability and shelter and other forms of assistance, but also other interventions that promote supply and things like that that we depend on. So more details on that shortly. On our organizational update, our wonderful communications director, Haley Solomon, is at the National Alliance for Ending Homelessness Conference in DC this week. So we're excited to hear her report back about that when she gets back. On the advocacy side for federal policy news, we want to make sure that you continue to reach out to your representatives. I know that we've been saying that for weeks. Just go ahead and get comfortable to reaching out to them and communicating, because a lot of the federal budget and policy decisions that are being proposed honestly threaten the future of a lot of our work. And so one example of this is that earlier this month, actually last month, HUD published a proposed rule to rescind the furthering fair housing regulations. And if finalized, this rule would essentially remove requirements that ensure that HUD assisted properties use an affirmative fair housing marketing plan to advertise their properties. This is a long-standing, actually historically uncontroversial rule that's really just designed to ensure that outreach is made to all potentially eligible households, especially those that are least likely to apply for assistance. And so this is especially important if a development is located in a low poverty area. And so this move comes as another blow, honestly, in a series of efforts by the current administration to get a lot of the fair housing and equity measures. Public comments on this proposed rule are due July 3rd, which is Thursday. And if you would like to sign on to a letter, the Poverty and Race Research Action Council, PRAC, is circulating a sign-on letter, which you can also access and sign on to using a link in the call notes. They're asking for signatures by 12 noon on July 3rd. And also public comments on the rule are due on July 3rd as well. One of our senators, North Carolina Senator Thom Tillis, has announced over the weekend, he announced that he would not run for office again in 2026. And this was ultimately in response to his comments for the One Big Beautiful Act. Senate Republicans, again, like I mentioned, as of a few minutes ago, really as of 9:23 a.m. was the last time we checked, are still debating amendments related to this Republican reconciliation bill. And so as of this morning, we're still waiting on the final vote. They are working towards an initial July 4th deadline, but President Trump has already communicated that he's willing to shift this deadline in order to get the bill passed. And the main thing that we want to lift up about this bill is that there are several proposed cuts on programs like SNAP and Medicaid that would impact economic stability for peoples and families, and that would shift a lot of the costs to states. And so there are two links in the call notes for you to learn about the pending vote and the potential impacts to North Carolina. We like to look at bills like this as holistically as possible. And so just want to emphasize that these programs not only provide assistance in terms of food and resources, but there are ways that Medicaid also can contribute and pay for housing needs as well. So the proposed cuts would have a really broad impact. One actually really interesting and a great example of advocacy efforts that have been released around the appropriations process for the federal fiscal year 26 process is that the U.S. Conference of Mayors recently passed a resolution in support of extending funding for the Emergency Housing Voucher Program. And this is a great example of ways that councils, associations, organizations, different groups or coalitions can speak up about the need for extending funding for programs such as these. And so we'll link the resolution and more news about that effort in the call notes for you, as well as a toolkit from our partners at the National Low Income Housing Coalition on how to talk about, communicate, and engage around opposing cuts to federal investments in affordable housing. Again, we have seen this happen over the last several decades, but there's already been a trend of federal investments not really keeping up with the need and sort of retreating over time. And so that pushes that responsibility to the states to find the resources for a lot of the programs and work that we do. And so when that shifts to the states, then that also then shifts additional responsibilities to the localities, and it really is a big waterfall effect there. Moving on to statewide updates. The state fiscal year ended yesterday, June 30th, and we're going to link a resource again in the call notes for you from the School of Government about what happens when the North Carolina state budget is not enacted by July 1st, which is today. Essentially, the way the law works is that if the General Assembly has not enacted a budget by the start of the fiscal year in odd numbered years, the law, particularly that deals with this, allows for a continuation budget to automatically take effect. And so what that means is allocations that are made to state departments, agencies, and institutions that are made that are recurring funds from the prior year's certified budget will be made again. So just want to lift up though that this applies again to recurring funds. So a few things that are impacted. The Workforce Housing Loan Program is not a recurring allocation. And so this is a great example of why we consistently push not only for a greater investment in the program itself, but for it to be a recurring allocation. We also want to highlight that the Workforce Housing Loan Program is not being singled out. However, we still need to make sure that we continue engaging with leadership in both chambers as well as on the conference committees to highlight the importance of this critical housing finance tool. Not only is it one of our most impactful tools for housing finance and housing development because of its strengths for leveraging, along with the low-income housing tax credit, but also it's going to and continues to play a critical role in disaster recovery long term. And so we want to make sure that we're not releasing any pressure and that we're continuing to remind our representatives about the effectiveness of this program, the great need of this program. Because so far in the proposed budget, both chambers contain really minimal to no investment in housing, unfortunately. And so even though budget negotiations have stalled for now, and the differences, again, housing is not being singled out, key differences are really around tax cuts and funding sources for different allocations. Both versions of the proposed budget for the next biennium really have kind of disappointingly low or absent levels of housing investment. For example, in the Senate version of the proposed budget, there's no money at all for the Workforce Housing Loan Program, so zero. In the House version, there's only $5 million in Workforce Housing Loan Program funding proposed for the first year of the biennium, which would essentially cover maybe a project and a half in one or two counties. So we need to, again, continue to push and advocate for the tools that we have that we know work, that we know we really need. And this is a tool that not only benefits the entire state, but really goes a long way in our rural areas and in our areas recovering from disaster. I also want to lift up that the Healthy Opportunities Pilot is another program that is impacted. And there are some housing elements to that, home repair, different elements like that. So a lot of our partners have already reached out to us about their concern as it relates to the absence of HOP funding. There's no HOP funding in either the House or the Senate budget proposals, and the impact will essentially be immediate. Because there's no funding in either version, for the Healthy Opportunities Pilots program, the outcome really is going to impact service delivery funding allocation. So at this time, because of the absence of available funding, that means there will be no funding scheduled for distribution to health plans or other programs for HOP service delivery beginning today. And so while new services are expected to stop today, the hope is that this will only be a pause and that hopefully the HOP program can resume once additional funds are appropriated by General Assembly. This is another great example of how, although this is part of a greater, wider, healthier communities effort and is really tied to healthcare. Remember, housing is healthcare. Housing because of how much of an essential human need it is. All of these cuts or the absence of investment or low investment, it has these deep ripple effects from each part of our state to all communities participating. So there is a lot at stake. And so that's why we continue to ask for you all to engage, communicate. If you are in a community that has a development that was funded in part by Workforce Housing Loan Program dollars, invite your representative to come see it. Remind them that it is a beautiful place. Why is it needed? How has it helped you or your community, or how does it help the work you do? How has the Healthy Opportunities Pilots supported your work, your community, those that you serve? So a lot of opportunities for great stories, great engagement here. And again, not from a place of yelling or shame or anything, but of really highlighting this is a human need, and this is life. We're talking about quality of life. Additional legislative updates. So we have a lot of different pieces of legislation that we're continuing to kind of analyze now that we're taking a brief break. We're looking at overall what has happened so far this session. So excluding resolutions, there have been almost 1,800 bills that have been introduced this session, and almost 160 of them relate to our policy agenda or policy priorities in some way. We tried to track them using things like keywords, but then sometimes they would slip through, right? So then we had to broaden that list of keywords. Right now, based on those that survived crossover, we're still tracking around 47 bills that related to our policy priorities. But there were almost 100 bills that were related to housing in that sort of broader 1,800 number. A lot of the key themes of the bills that we've been tracking and we've been looking at closely, there's a big range. So it ranges from criminalization of homelessness, disaster recovery, land use and zoning. There have been a lot of bills around down zoning. There were also some really great, but unfortunately unsuccessful efforts so far to improve the facilitation of supply using land use tools. There have been reform around homeowners associations, HOA reforms around transparency of documents and when liens can be placed. Also, property tax relief has been on a number of bills, as well as deed fraud. I do want to lift up one bill because there's still a few that have been moving, and there are several that moved last week. But one in particular is a House Bill 369 that passed the House last week and is now in the Senate. But the Parking Lot Reform and Modernization Act, a great shout out to Ryan and the Catawba River Valley Keepers. It's a great example of how policy change such as this can help reduce construction costs and improve the facilitation of developing housing at all points. And so this particular bill, again, House Bill 369, it essentially prohibits there to be sort of a minimum parking requirement or for there to be a minimum square footage on certain structures subject to regulation under the North Carolina Residential Code. There are certain tweaks in this policy that account for, the fire code access. There are also some stormwater management components as well. And then there are also funds proposed to the Department of Commerce in the sum of $5,000 in non-recurring funds to help assist property owners on the financial opportunities that relate to adjusting the number of parking spaces within their parking lots so that it can better align with actual and anticipated usage. So this crosses over several different policy areas. One of the things that many people are often surprised about is how expensive parking actually can be. And so when you take away parking minimums, sometimes parking minimums lead to overbuilt parking. You have too much. You have too much impervious surface, and so that can contribute to flooding. It can also raise the cost of housing and limit the number of units you can actually build on a given part of land. And so this is an example of a fairly simple policy switch that could help facilitate the development of more housing and increased housing supply. We know is one of the key interventions for increasing affordable housing as well. Moving on to disaster recovery, and then I just have a few other pieces for you. House Bill 1012, the Disaster Recovery Act of 2025, Part 2, passed after going into conference committee last week and was signed by Governor Stein on Friday. This bill, however, primarily focuses on infrastructure and does not include any funds for housing. A key reminder for folks in Western North Carolina or working with people and families in Western North Carolina, the Renew North Carolina Single Family Housing Program began accepting applications. And so low to moderate income Helene survivors living in owner occupied homes that were damaged by the storm can still apply for assistance with housing rehab or replacement. The priority will be given to households with seniors that are 62 or older, children and or people with disabilities. We really encourage folks to apply as soon as possible because the funds are limited. So even though the application will be open all year, know that these is a finite amount of funds. So make sure that you recommend this to the folks that you work with or those that you're connected with if they qualify. And last but not least, of course, we always have several events and reports and resources for you. One webinar I want to lift up in particular for you. Many of you know that we're part of the Opportunity Starts at Home cohort with the National Low Income Housing Coalition. And on July 8th, which is next Tuesday at 2 p.m., one of the other partners that are part of the national cohort is hosting a webinar titled Solving School Age Homelessness Through School and Housing Partnership. So that will be at 2 p.m. on July 8th, and we'll have the registration link in the call notes for you. And last but not least, the report we want to lift up, although there are a few in the call notes for you to review, is the State of the Nation's Housing Report that was released last week. Again, this report continues to show that there's a growing need. This is not going away, a growing need for housing options at all income levels. The report in particular highlights that half of all renters in 2023 were cost burdened, and this is a new record of almost 23 million renters. They were spending more than 30% or more of their household incomes on housing and utilities. And then the report also lifted up that the renters with annual incomes that were under $30,000 on average had, on average, only $250 or less left to spend on other necessities. So think about groceries, transportation, childcare. And while renter households across all income levels have been affected by rising housing costs, the report found that the rate of cost burden, so paying more than 30% of their gross income on housing, the rate of cost burden among households with incomes between $45,000 and $75,000 a year has actually doubled to 45% since 2001. So still cost burdens are most prevalent among the renters with the lowest incomes, but we're seeing this cost burden, this issue, this affordability issue affect all households at all income levels. And then last but not least, the report emphasizes the need for housing supports. And this is why we continue to lift up the need for your advocacy and your voice at the federal level and the state level. The report talks about how much housing support and other forms of assistance are under threat under the current administration due to the proposed reductions in federal resources. And that's extremely dangerous. And that's only going to contribute to the findings that the report lifts up. Because assistance can't keep up with the growing need for affordable rental units, as the growth of the number of very low income renters actually outpaces the growth in the number of eligible renters receiving housing assistance, then the last thing that we need to happen is for this type of assistance to be reduced or cut or eliminated. And so I'll leave it there for you. We have a lot of great stuff in the call notes for you. And as always, please don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions or you want us to focus on anything in particular. I hope you all have a great rest of your week, and we'll talk to you next time.